So next up, podcast listeners, inflation is here to stay. You're going to really appreciate this segment because so many people have spoken about inflation, and rightfully so, but people don't understand what real inflation actually does or what it looks like. So in the Wall Street Journal, there is an op-ed, and it's called, "What if Inflation is Here to Stay?" It's an opinion piece. Are price increases transitory? Some of the factors driving them certainly aren't. And this particular piece is by William A. Galston. And we're going to play a bunch of clips from Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan about the time in the 1970s and early 80s when inflation was out of control. And what's amazing is almost every American that's around today, they've either forgotten it or they weren't around or they never studied it. They don't understand how bad and how destructive this was to the middle class and to our economy. So we're going to play some clips on that. So this particular piece, what if inflation is here to stay? Americans are worried about inflation. This was the #1 economic concern expressed in a recent survey from the Pew Research Center. Some 63% said they are very concerned about rising prices, especially food and consumer goods, compared with only 29% who are very concerned that Americans won't be able to find work. This focus on higher prices is easy to explain. Consumer inflation is running above 5%. It's above 5%. Wiping out nominal wage gains for low-income workers. So podcast listeners, if inflation is above 5% and you're a saver, you're someone who likes to save money, and you put the money in a bank, you're not even going to get close to 1%. Not even close. So your money is worth less by putting it in the bank. So what are you supposed to do with it? It's unbelievable. The Labor Department reports that businesses investing in their long-term production capacity are facing the largest price hikes since 1982. Since 1982. Okay? Which brings us to the historical facts in American history about what inflation looked like at a different time. And when you really think about it, they actually look very similar. They may be different times, but they both experience very similar economic turbulence. So first up, here's Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. In 1978, October of 1978, he actually had an entire press conference at the White House, and he gave a statement about inflation because that's how bad inflation was. Imagine that. You're sitting in the Oval Office and you say to all the media, I need to make this statement about inflation because it's so incredibly bad. You know, there's so many other things he could make the case about, but he had to speak about inflation in 1978 because it was simply out of control. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is Jimmy Carter. Here's the clip.
Restraint involves tax policy as well as spending decisions. Tax reduction has never been more politically popular than it is today. But if future tax cuts are made rashly, with no eye on the budget deficits, they will hurt us all by causing more inflation. There are tax cuts which could directly lower costs and prices and help in the fight against inflation. I may consider ways to reduce those particular taxes while still cutting the budget deficit. But until we have a convincing prospect of controlling inflation, I will oppose any further reductions in federal income tax.
So that's Jimmy Carter. Can you imagine, by the way, any Democrat talking that way today, that he's concerned about the spending in government and its impact on inflation? Well, what about the spending today and its impact on inflation? Inflation is already at 5%. So Jimmy Carter had inflation in 78 that was simply out of control. There was a war, the Vietnam War. It had ended in the early 70s. But the spending for the Vietnam War was so out of control that the U.S. economy was in shambles for years and years later. Not unlike the war in Afghanistan that lasted for 20 years, and the spending was out of control. And now Democrats, as a result of COVID, want to spend more money than ever, and we haven't even recovered. We haven't even recovered from the previous spending sprees that have occurred both under Republican and Democrats' watch. So here's more from Jimmy Carter's anti-inflation speech He's actually talking about taming government growth. That's how bad things were back then with inflation. So bad that a Democrat actually wanted to control the growth of government. We have that clip, and here it is.
To keep the government to a manageable size, I'm ordering tonight a cut in federal hiring. This order will mean a reduction of more than 20,000 in the number of permanent federal employees already budgeted for this fiscal year, and will cut the total size of the federal workforce. I've already placed a 5.5% cap on the pay increase for federal employees, and federal executive officers are receiving no pay increases at all.
Yeah, so that's Jimmy Carter in 1978 saying there is a hiring freeze in the federal government and a desire to reduce the government by 20,000 positions through attrition and other ways. That's how dangerous the United States economy was. That's how on a precipice, much of a precipice it was on of failing, just failing and falling apart because inflation was through the roof. Interest rates were through the roof. Government spending was out of control for well over a decade because of the Vietnam War and other reasons. And then you get Jimmy Carter there. He's a Democrat, and he's saying, we don't have any choice but to stop the growth of government because, you know, what else are we going to do? There's too much money out there in the economy. And that money that's out there in the economy is causing prices to go through the roof. So here's more from Jimmy Carter, where he says everything has a price, which is pretty remarkable when you compare it to today, which we will. Here's that clip.
But we must also realize that everything has a price and that consumers eventually pick up the tab. Where regulations are essential, they must be efficient. Where they fight inflation, they should be encouraged. Where they are unnecessary, they should be removed.
Everything has a price, Jimmy Carter said, and consumers pick up the price. So he's referring to government spending, and he's referring to inflation. Of course, he's trying to explain it away. I mean, obviously, his management of the economy was horrendous, which is why we got a Ronald Reagan. But if you compare what Jimmy Carter just said, everything has a price, to President Biden's recent tweet, where he says, my Build Back Better agenda costs $0. Instead of wasting money on tax breaks and loopholes and tax evasion, instead of like letting, those deplorables keep the money that they earn, those pesky people, and giving it to the wealthy, we can make a once-in-a-generation investment in working America, and it adds $0 to the national debt. I mean, that is the modern Democrat Party. Can you imagine anyone saying that ever? Compared to what Jimmy Carter, who was a liberal, right? The classic liberal back in the 1970s. And today, we don't have classic liberals. We have Democrat socialists. They are socialists. I'm not even sure they're democratic at all, but I think they're socialists. So Jimmy Carter lost his election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, when he was inaugurated in January of 1981, the following month in February of 1981, he gave a speech about inflation. Because obviously inflation carried all through the Carter years, his 4-year term, the Carter years in the late 70s, and carried into the Reagan years because Reagan was elected to fix the problem. And here's Reagan addressing the problem head on. We have that clip, and here it is.
20 years ago, in 1960, our federal government payroll was less than $13 billion. Today, it is $75 billion. During these 20 years, our population has only increased by 23.3%. The federal budget has gone up 528%. Now, we've just had 2 years of back-to-back double-digit inflation. 13.3% in 1979, 12.4% last year. The last time this happened was in World War I. In 1960, mortgage interest rates averaged about 6%. They're 2.5 times as high now, 15.4%. The percentage of your earnings the federal government took in taxes in 1960 has almost doubled.
Yeah, so Ronald Reagan in 1981 had just been inaugurated, and he was sitting in the same Oval Office that Jimmy Carter had been sitting in just a couple of years later talking about inflation. And there's Reagan basically taking inflation on head on. I mean, he's basically talking about inflation in 79 was 13.3%. And in 1980, inflation was 12.4%. Inflation today, podcast listeners, is 5% and rising. And interest rates in 1980 were 15.4%. 15.4%. And why is that? Because when the federal government keeps spending, it crowds out the ability of the average person to be able to borrow money. And in addition to that, when the federal government keeps spending and puts too much money into the economy, combined with the Federal Reserve, obviously, you have too much money in the economy and that results in inflation. I mean, kind of obvious. Well, here's Ronald Reagan in classic Reagan approach with communicating to people and showing them what real inflation looks like. This is what the Republican Party, really conservatives, as far as I'm concerned, not even Republicans, but conservatives, need to be doing today about inflation. Because the American people are really concerned about this. I am too. Here's Reagan in 1981 talking about what inflation really looks like. We have that clip, and here it is.
Let me try to put this in personal terms. Here is a dollar such as you earned, spent, or saved in 1960. And here is a quarter, a dime, and a penny. 36 cents. That's what this 1960 dollar is worth today. And at the present world inflation rate, and our rate should continue 3 more years, that dollar of 1960 will be worth a quarter. What initiative is there to save? And if we don't save, we're short of the investment capital needed for business and industry expansion.
The American people want predictability. Why would the American people ever save money if they thought their money would eventually be worthless by the time they got to retirement? Why would they do that? How could they do that? How could they survive into retirement? This was a big issue in the late 1970s and the 1980s, and it ushered in a conservative era in America with Ronald Reagan, where people realized that actually math matters. Math actually matters. And fast forward today, we don't have Democrat politicians who believe that math matters. And Reagan did such a commonsensical way of showing people, here's a dollar, and he pulled out the dollar in the Oval Office. You know, in a couple of years, it's going to be worth a quarter based on what it was worth in 1960. But it's rapidly being worth less because of government, not because of you, because of government. That's happening today, podcast listeners. Here's Senator Patty Murray on the Senate floor just yesterday, speaking about the debt ceiling. Now, remember, Congress can't borrow above the debt ceiling unless they raise the debt ceiling. And raising the debt ceiling requires a vote. The Republicans are not voting to increase the debt ceiling. Democrats are obviously furious because they're like, we need to continue to borrow, to spend. And, because there's no, people are going to die if we don't spend. This is the same old Democrat crap. People will die if we don't spend more money. Honestly, no one believes this anymore. No one. But Senator Patty Murray, who is a socialist, is nonetheless on the Senate floor, of course, trashing Republicans about the debt ceiling and learned nothing from the Reagan years, even though she's old enough to remember them. Here she is. We have that clip, and here it is.
Senate Democrats just gave Republicans yet another opportunity to do the right thing, to make sure the United States government pays its bills, like every working family in our country does. Now, Senate Republicans have acknowledged that even though default would be catastrophic for our economy, they would not vote to prevent it. No Republican votes or help to prevent an economic catastrophe. And now they've kicked their brinkmanship up another notch by blocking Democrats only, from voting to avoid default with a purely Democratic vote. This makes no sense if you truly care about our workers, about our families, about our hard-won economic recovery. It only makes sense if their goal is economic sabotage, if they're so willing to put politics first that you'd put the American economy on the line. And that, Mr. President, is apparently what the Republican Party stands for today, until proven otherwise. Economic sabotage and politics first, no matter who gets hurt. This is a disgrace. It's an embarrassment. But it's not going to stop Democrats from fighting to protect our economy from the devastating consequences of default. Because let me be clear, Republicans may think this is some obscure fight right now, but it will not be if it hits American bank accounts. And they are fooling themselves if they think people won't know who's responsible.
So that's Senator Patty Murray of Washington State saying that the world is going to fall apart because the Republicans won't vote for the debt ceiling. By the way, the Democrats have the numbers to raise the debt ceiling in both the House and the Senate. They don't need the Republicans to raise the debt ceiling. And the Democrats own this debt ceiling increase, and they own the spending, and they own the inflation, which they are causing. And so here she is doing the same old Democrat talking point, and people are not going to be able to work, and they're not going to be able to get all the child care and so forth that they need. Folks, what difference does any of that make if your dollar is worth less and less as a result of all the spending that they're taking on? And moreover, this debt ceiling issue, it's the equivalent of saying, hey, look, we're going to go out and spend as much money as we want, and by the way, I need you to be responsible for going and getting the loan to pay for it. And then you look at the person, you say, well, wait a minute, you spent the money. Why would I go get the loan, right? Why would I raise the money by borrowing the money at a bank to pay off all of the debt that you've incurred because you don't know how to control your spending? That's exactly what the Democrats are saying. They're saying, we want to keep spending. Hey, Republicans, raise the debt ceiling so we can keep spending. The Republicans are saying, no, we don't want to do that because you're out of control. And, at least the Republicans are doing something now, but the Democrats can easily do this because they have the numbers. They have the numbers. So I actually think it's entirely possible, podcast listeners, that inflation is here to stay, and that we're also seeing the beginning of the spiking of interest rates as well, which of course would look just like the 1970s, stagflation, high interest rates for borrowing and high inflation. In which case, how do you get out of that, right? You get out of that by controlling the size of government and paring it back significantly. And that is a very unpopular thing to do unless you have the communication skills of a Ronald Reagan. And I'm not really sure who out there in the Republican Party or in the conservative movement has that ability right now. Maybe Governor DeSantis of Florida is probably the closest that we have as far as I'm concerned.